Over the last couple of days, Ukraine has been engaged in two counteroffensives, or offensives if you prefer. One north of Kharkiv, which appears to be aimed at reaching the Russian border, but which also seems to have had an intention or an objective of encircling and trapping some Russian troops who were close to Kharkiv city, and a second, which is an attempt to recapture Snake Island. This is this island some 30 kilometers from Odessa, off the coast of Odessa, which was captured by the Russians early in the war. Now, turning first to the offensive around close to Kharkiv, when I discussed it yesterday, I said, on the basis of information that I'd received from various Russian sources who have been discussing this Ukrainian offensive in considerable detail, that its primary purpose appeared to be to persuade the Russians to divert troops from Izium, from the main battle lines in Donbass, to try to control or contain this offensive, which was taking place in northern Kharkiv region. I think that may be part of the thinking behind this offensive, but I have come to the view that there is actually an even more important reason behind this offensive, and which also touches on the events in Snake Island, which I'm going to discuss in a few moments. And that is that I think both this offensive in northern Kharkiv region and the attack on Snake Island are essentially PR exercises intended to show that the Ukrainians are fighting and going on the attack in various places on the eve of the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. In other words, they are an attempt to spoil Moscow's Victory Day celebrations, give Ukraine a propaganda win, and, by the way, also reinforce the narrative, which we've seen so widely articulated in the Western media, that Ukraine is in some form winning the war. Well, let's turn first to that offensive in northern Kharkiv region. The Ukrainians did capture a number of villages, and it seems, however, that the Russian and allied troops, mainly troops, by the way, of the Lugansk militia in this part of Kharkiv region, were relatively few in number, and that the Russian military took a decision to pull them back. They also took a decision, and this is an important contrast with the kind of stand and fight orders that the Ukrainians seem to follow. They also took a decision to pull back the Russian troops who were stationed closer to Kharkiv city, thereby defeating, or rather, if you like, negating whatever Ukrainian plan there might have been to encircle and trap these troops. Now, this is a tactical withdrawal. It's the sort of thing that military leaders do in war. Going back to the fighting in Ukraine in 2014, the pro-Russian militia that was in occupation of the town of Slavyansk decided to withdraw from Slavyansk when it became clear that it would not be able to withstand the Ukrainian counterattack against that city. And it withdrew to the far more important and far more easily defended city of Donetsk, from which it was able to mount a spirited resistance to the Ukrainian offensive, leading eventually to creating the conditions which led to that Ukrainian offensive's failure, this in the summer of 2014. Well, the Russians did exactly the same in northern Kharkiv region. They didn't throw away lives and equipment in order to hold on to various villages of little strategic significance. They were obviously not waging a PR war, so they decided to withdraw these troops, with the result that the Ukrainian offensive basically punched air. Now, over the last few hours, I've been hearing reports that the Russians have launched strikes which have demolished certain bridges. This is being a war of demolishing bridges in many places. Anyway, the Russians seem to have carried out strikes demolishing several bridges in this region. And it is not, to my mind, entirely impossible that the Russians are retreating in order to lure the Ukrainian troops, who are also apparently relatively few in number, into a position where they too could be perhaps trapped against the Russian border and eventually surrounded and destroyed. Now, that's a guess. I'm not sure that's the case, but in any case, this much trumpeted Ukrainian offensive, heavily promoted by neocon outfits like the Institute of War in the United States, seems to me to have achieved little of any real significance. The events in Snake Island have been altogether more dramatic, and here I have to say that this seems to have been a rather more serious Ukrainian offensive. Now, say Snake Island, I'm not sure what military significance it has, or whether it has any military significance, but clearly it's become an important symbol, at least for Ukraine. And there seems to have been, over the last couple of weeks, a serious preparation of an attack on Snake Island from Odessa in order to recapture it. Now, it's possible, in fact, I think it is highly likely that the Moskva incident may in some way have been connected with the preparations to recapture Snake Island. Anyway, the Ukrainians did eventually launch their attack over the course of the last few hours. And here there's a certain amount of fog of war, but what is quite clear is that the Russians had been expecting this attack. They had actually withdrawn all their troops from Snake Island, in effect inviting the Ukrainians to try to deploy troops there. Ukrainian troops then tried to land on Snake Island in helicopters and amphibious craft. The helicopters were destroyed. Most of the amphibious craft were destroyed as well. The Ukrainian troops on Snake Island appear to have suffered serious losses and appear to have retreated. The survivors appear to have returned to in Odessa in inflatable boats, or at least that's most of what the reports are saying. And by the way, I'm basing this on reports both from Ukrainian as well as Russian sources. Of course, that is not quite what the Ukrainian military, or at least the Ukrainian government, is saying. They've attempted to pass off film of the destruction of one of their helicopters on Snake Island as a destruction of a Russian helicopter on Snake Island. But I think there's been quite a lot of analysis of that video, and it's conclusively proved that the helicopter in question, a Mil-8, was in fact a Ukrainian helicopter participating in this attack. I suspect that the reports we were getting 2 days ago about the attack on Russia's Admiral Makarov frigate was also in some way connected to this particular incident. And of course, the Ukrainians also have released video of some kind of Russian amphibious craft, which was supposedly also destroyed near Snake Island by a Bayraktar drone. I should say that Russian commentators are very skeptical about the latter claim. They claim that the designation of this amphibious craft, which the Ukrainians are giving, is of one which does not exist in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, or indeed in any part of the Russian fleet. Well, I'm not going to comment on that, but in any event, the ship in question does not seem to have been an important vessel for the Russian Navy. So it seems, from the patchy information that we're getting, that the Snake Island attack was something of a debacle. Now, we're also getting further news that for today, Sunday, that a Ukrainian missile corvette one of the few remaining warships of the Ukrainian Navy, has also been destroyed, and it seems that also 2 Ukrainian aircraft were shot down. These are not, by the way, the Ukrainian aircraft which carried out a night raid on Snake Island. By that point, the Russian troops appear to have already withdrawn from Snake Island, and it seems that the bombs that these 2 Ukrainian aircraft dropped on Snake Island again hit empty ground. So it seems overall like something of a debacle, at least on the first day of what might be a still continuing battle. It's not clear exactly what is going on around Snake Island, but in any event, one thing does seem to be indisputable, which is that the Ukrainians have taken very heavy losses. I would add that there's also reports that these M77 US howitzers that we've been hearing so much about have not been deployed to the front lines in Donbass. They've been deployed around Odessa, and that their purpose was to provide artillery support for the Ukrainian troops who were going to be deployed to Snake Island in anticipation, presumably, of ground fighting there, which did not, of course, take place. Now, if these reports are accurate, it cannot be excluded that the Russians lured the Ukrainians into a trap on Snake Island, and for all I know, they're doing exactly the same thing in northern Kharkiv region. Now, all of this, of course, information is still extremely garbled and unclear. We don't have the whole story, and it is not impossible that the fighting around Snake Island is still ongoing, though, as I said, it does seem as if the Ukrainians took heavy losses on the first day. Anyway, all of this is secondary to what is happening in the main theatre of the war. And here we've had some very dramatic news. Firstly, it's now clear that the important town of Popasnaya is now essentially under Russian control. The Ukrainian unit that was defending Popasnaya has apparently withdrawn after taking extremely heavy losses. Apparently, it suffered more losses even as it withdrew. And with the capture by the Russian, or rather the militia forces, the Russian allied militia forces of Popasnaya, it seems that the trap around the major Ukrainian forces in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is now closing shut. And some of you will recall that about a week ago, perhaps even 2 weeks ago, I was reporting rumors that the Ukrainian troops were planning to withdraw from Severodonetsk. Apparently, there were indeed requests from the Ukrainian commanders on the ground for such withdrawals. The Ukrainian High Command in Kiev again countermanded those orders, and the result is that those troops now look increasingly likely that they're going to be trapped without any possibility of withdrawal at all. A withdrawal, by the way, would anyway have been a complicated affair given Russian control of the air over Donbass and the overwhelming Russian artillery, which would be able to inflict massive losses on any Ukrainian troops which were withdrawing across open country. But anyway, there we are. It seems that the trap around the forces in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk is now closing. There's some talk that Ukrainian troops are going to withdraw from Severodonetsk and retreat to Lysychansk itself. Lysychansk is apparently easier to defend and is on higher ground than Severodonetsk, and some suggest that it would be that the Ukrainian artillery in in Lysychansk would still be able to dominate the situation in Severodonetsk. Of course, that always assumes that artillery, that Ukrainian artillery, has shells, ammunition to continue to expend in the fighting for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk if this encirclement is completed. Now, I would add that the fall of Popasnaya, with the equivalent fall of Rubizhnoye earlier in the war, about a week ago, with the industrial areas of Rubizhnoye now also apparently under Russian or Allied control, not only tightens the trap around the Ukrainian forces in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, but it also signals what is likely to be the gradual collapse of Ukrainian resistance in this part of the Donbass, in the northern Donbass area, in this particular cauldron or encirclement which the Russians have been working to create for some time. Now, I don't know how many Ukrainian troops are trapped or likely to be trapped in the Lysychansk, Severodonetsk conurbation. I don't know how many Ukrainian troops there are there in total, but all the indications are that they're taking heavy losses and that they're finding that their position is gradually being ground down and is becoming increasingly hopeless. Now, further away, it seems there's also now an effective encirclement of Ukrainian troops in Liman on the way to Slavyansk. And though the Russian offensive south of Izium stopped, I suspect more for redeployments and things of that kind than because of any particular Ukrainian resistance, all the indications are that it will resume over the next few days, with Russian forces and Allied forces pressing ever closer to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which look like being encircled fairly soon in the same way that the troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are being. So this looks like a gradual slow motion collapse of Ukrainian forces in the northern area of the Donbass. Now, there are other concentrations of Ukrainian troops further south, opposite Donetsk city, and it's quite likely that their position is also going to become increasingly difficult before very long, with the redeployment of strike forces, Russian and militia strike forces from Mariupol further north. The Pentagon has essentially confirmed that most Donbass militia and most Russian troops have now left Mariupol and are beginning to concentrate concentrate further north with a view to cutting off the remaining communications links between Ukraine and in the important city of Zaporozhye and the Ukrainian troops opposite Donetsk. And of course, if this happens after the collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and the likely eventual collapse of Ukrainian resistance around Slavyansk and Mariupol, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, then that will mean the final collapse of the entire Ukrainian army in Donbass. Apparently, there have been increasing complaints from Ukrainian commanders and pushback from Ukrainian commanders and Ukrainian troops about these stand and fight orders. So far, the Ukrainian military has been obeying these orders, but I wonder for how much longer, given the scale of losses that the Ukrainians are experiencing and given the development of the battle. It's not impossible, it seems to me, that at some point commanders will start to take their decisions into their own hands and could prioritize the lives of their soldiers and, of course, quite possibly their own lives over orders from a government in Kiev, which is fighting what is increasingly, it seems to me, a media relations war rather than an actual one which is increasingly divorced from the military realities on the battlefronts. And here I have to discuss briefly, and again, the situation in Mariupol. The Ukrainian government has now confirmed that all civilians who were trapped in the Azovstal factory have been evacuated. Now, there's been much discussion about these civilians and why they were there. I've speculated that some of them may be families of some of the troops, Ukrainian troops, who are holed up inside the factory, and I still think that's possible. But some of these civilians have now given interviews in which they've complained about the fact that they were being kept in the factory and were being denied proper information about the situation. And they've made some criticisms of what the Ukrainian troops in the factory were doing. The Russians, of course, have claimed that these civilians were being held in the factory, in effect as hostages, to try to prevent a storming of the factory by the Russian military. That's a Russian claim. It's been repeated by many people across independent media. I can't corroborate it. I'm not saying whether or not it's true. But the fact that these civilians have now left does, it seems to me, leave the remaining Ukrainian troops in Azovstal in an extremely difficult position. Now, here, perhaps I'm going to just quickly say one further thing. It's quite clear to me that the Ukrainian command were unwilling to let these civilians leave, whilst the offers for their exit were being negotiated purely by the Russians. The Russians found a solution to this problem by inviting the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, to Moscow. I was surprised that they actually did so, given the words of criticism that he has made about the whole Ukraine operation. But clearly, Guterres was brought to Moscow in order to get the UN's humanitarian agencies and the International Red Cross involved in evacuating the civilians from Azovstal. And it's quite clear that the Ukrainian authorities were not willing to go against the UN agencies or the International Committee of the Red Cross, and that is what caused the civilians to be successfully withdrawn from the factory. But as I said, this has left the Ukrainian troops in Azovstal in a very difficult position. And it's perhaps now appropriate to say something about these troops, because in previous programs I've discussed some rather fervid and passionate videos sent out of Azovstal by a Ukrainian officer, a person who I've always referred to as Commander Volina. I've never been exactly clear as to his precise role or position in the military hierarchy in Azovstal, or even which unit he belongs to, even though he has represented himself and been accepted by most of the media as the commander of the Ukrainian Marine Forces, which are part of the Ukrainian regular army, which has been defending Mariupol. Well, I've not disputed this up to now, and I still don't fully dispute it. I think it's possible, quite possible, that he does belong to this unit. But an interesting fact has now happened, which is that the actual commander of this unit, an officer called Colonel Baranyuk, has now appeared, and it's clear that he is in Russian captivity, as is his deputy commander. And Colonel Baranyuk has given interviews on Russian media, which I have no intention of discussing. I think it's frankly inappropriate to have officers in the middle of a war interviewed in this way. But clearly, he doesn't seem to be part of the same command structure as Commander Volina is. And I've heard suggestions that though Commander Volina, I'm not even sure what his exact rank is indeed a Marine officer. The number of actual Ukrainian Marines in the factory is perhaps 50, and that most of the Ukrainian troops in Azovstal are indeed from the Azov Battalion and other irregular forces, as had appeared to be the case, or was being reported to be the case a few weeks ago, before Commander Volina appeared and started to make his videos. Anyway, regardless of his exact role, or what he exactly does, or what his actual command position is, the fact remains that he continues to paint a desperate picture of the condition of the Ukrainian forces in Azovstal. He continues to plead for a Ukrainian counteroffensive to relieve the Ukrainian troops trapped in the Azovstal factory. That, it seems to me, is a fantastic idea, and he still asks for some form of evacuation of these troops to some third country, which is also an idea that the Russians have completely ruled out. He's also suggested that the wounded, at least, be evacuated from the factory to a third country. I understand that the Russians are rejecting that also. They're insisting that all of the troops, the Ukrainian troops in Azovstal, must surrender to a man. Well, we will see what happens, but I do ask myself that now that the civilians are no longer there, again, what is the point of these troops in Azovstal continuing to hold out in the way that they are? The Russians have resumed heavy artillery shelling of Azovstal. They're bombing the factory with their heavy bombers. One could see some rather terrifying pictures of these huge bunker-busting bombers falling on the factory. It doesn't seem to me as if it makes any sense for these troops, who by their own account are running out of food, to continue to holding out in Azovstal. And I would have thought that some kind of negotiated surrender is the obvious and logical way forward. Now, on the question of relief, of Ukrainian offensives coming to rescue the troops in Azovstal, I have to say that I'm getting increasing numbers of reports that Ukrainian commanders all across the Donbass, who find themselves in impossible positions, have been receiving the same promises from Kiev, that help is on its way, except, of course, that help never comes. And there's even some reports that Popasnaya itself, that the Ukrainian unit that was defending Popasnaya, was also receiving repeated promises of a relief operation to save them from imminent, from defeat or destruction or encirclement or whatever. And there were even some reports a couple of days ago of Ukraine actually throwing 3,000 troops, it's unclear from where they were coming from, into some sort of counteroffensive in Lugansk region, presumably to relieve the troops in Popasnaya or in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation. Only this counteroffensive never seems to have materialized. I have to say that, and I come back to my video yesterday, that all of this again shows the danger of trying to win the war through, if you like, information, through propaganda, if you like, through all of those sort of things. As I said, propaganda is an unavoidable part of war. But if you are deceiving your own men, if you're deceiving your own commanders, if you're asking them to hold and stand, make stands which are hopeless and which will lead you to eventual defeat, if you're causing your soldiers as a result to die in pointless defenses of undefendable positions, then this propaganda that you're waging, this propaganda war that you are waging, doesn't help you win. It leads you into a trap. And I worry that that is exactly what Ukraine is doing. The attack on Snake Island seems to me to fall into this category. Perhaps Snake Island has some larger military significance, which as a non-military person, I cannot personally see. Or perhaps there are some strategic plans connected to this offensive in Kharkiv, which again, I don't see. But if these are, as I strongly suspect, public relations exercises to reinforce a narrative of Ukrainian victory, even as the front, the northern front in Donbass, is showing now undoubted signs of collapse and disintegration, then all I can say is that it is wrong and even immoral and is a betrayal of the fighting men on the battle lines. Now, again, there were reports about a month ago that Ukrainian commanders on the battlefields in Donbass were warning Kiev that the position of the Ukrainian army in Donbass was unsustainable and proposing a withdrawal to more defendable lines. If that is true, it's a tragedy that that wasn't done. And perhaps the best thing to do now, given that I doubt that such an orderly retreat as might have been possible a month ago is now possible, probably the best thing for Ukraine to do is to try to put aside some of these false counsels from Britain and the United States and to try to look for some way to restart the negotiations with the Russians. The Russians must be extremely angry about the way in which Ukraine went back on its promises in Istanbul, the promises it had made, the concessions it had made in Istanbul. And by the way, I'm getting more information about this. It seems that the United States and Britain point blank told Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, that if Zelensky did indeed make the did indeed act on his promise at the promise of his negotiators in Istanbul, that security guarantees from other powers for Ukraine's future security would not cover Crimea and Donbass, then apparently Boris Johnson and officials in the US warned Ukraine that in that case Britain and the United States would simply refuse to give Ukraine the security guarantees it was looking for. And that, together with the promise of Western military aid, was what apparently persuaded Ukraine to keep fighting. Well, the Ukrainians should by now have come to understand that these promises from the West and these threats from the West are leading Ukraine ever further down a trap. I think that they should stop worrying or thinking about what the West is going to do and start looking be more focused upon what is happening in Ukraine on the ground. The missile war against Ukrainian industrial facilities, against the Ukrainian transport system, against the Ukrainian oil and refinery system that the Russians have been waging over the last few weeks is continuing. In fact, it continues to intensify. There are reports that Ukrainian losses are now increasing by the day. I'm going to say this. I saw a figure. I can't confirm this. I'm not sure it's true, but there was a figure that up to 790 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in a single day. It's the only figure of that nature I'm going to repeat. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but it does seem as if Ukraine is losing large numbers of men killed on the battlefield. And I've also seen, by the way, another report which is allegedly drawn from Ukrainian sources, which gives totals for Ukrainian killed and wounded, which are in the very high thousands. I'm not going to quote the exact figure again because I can't corroborate this figure myself, but which do seem to be roughly in line with the kind of losses that the Russians claim that they're inflicting on Ukraine. Well, even if these figures are wrong and inaccurate, it is indisputable, or so it seems to me, that Ukraine is suffering massive losses on the battlefields, and it is losing ground where it matters in Donbass, and before long, it is going to lose full control of both the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, as well as of most of Zaporozhye region and of all of Kherson region. So I think that the Ukrainians need to focus on those realities, on the ongoing collapse of the Ukrainian economy, on the likely eventual collapse of its financial system. It's clear that tax collection in Ukraine has almost completely disintegrated, that the Ukrainian budget is an extraordinary deficit, and that relying on the West to plug the financial gaps, whilst it might keep some kind of the Ukrainian currency functioning, it's only going to create a system of economic dependence, which, as I've said in previous programs, is profoundly demoralizing on an economy, as was shown previously in the cases of South Vietnam and Afghanistan. So I think that the Ukrainians need to look at the situation on the ground and come back to those difficult decisions that they were starting to make during the fighting in March. And I think they need to put aside the false counsels of people like Boris Johnson and whoever is speaking to them from the United States, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, whoever that is, and accept that some kind of negotiation, some kind of negotiated solution to this war is the correct way forward. Now, I suspect that the Russians, very angered by what happened in the week after the apparent move by the Ukrainians to make those concessions in Istanbul, are going to be less, shall we say, accommodating than they were during the negotiations in Istanbul. A disastrous month, more than a month, has been lost as a result of the switch in Ukrainian positions. But hopefully, and just perhaps, they will still be in a mood to negotiate with the Ukrainians to seek some sort of compromise. Well, we will see. I'm not sure that the Russians would be prepared to do that, but perhaps, given that from the Russian point of view, I suspect a diplomatic solution to the war is probably something that would help them, especially in their relations with friendly countries like India and China. In other words, that it might not be fully in Russian interests to seek a complete military solution, simply because Beijing and Delhi and other capitals might not be entirely happy with that. Given that that is so, it's just possible that the Russians might come back to the negotiating table and negotiate with the Ukrainians, even though their demands will almost certainly be harder than they were when the concessions appear to have been made in Istanbul. I'm going to say, in addition to this, that there were some words from Zelensky the other day which did suggest that his mind might be turning back towards negotiations. He again said that he was open to a diplomatic solution, though he did what he always does, which was make impossible red lines, such as that the Russians withdraw all their troops back to the lines, to the positions that they had before the fighting began on the 24th of February. I would say that though that is an impossible demand, and one which the Russians will certainly reject, it is certainly different from the position taken by the British government and by the American government, which appears to be that Ukraine should seek outright victory. In other words, that the Russians should pull back not just to the lines that they had before the 24th of February, but should effectively withdraw entirely from Donbass and Kherson and Zaporozhye and Crimea as well. So, though Zelensky's demands are, as I said, impossible and unreasonable, they do perhaps suggest a break from the extreme demands which continue to be made by the Americans and the British. And that may perhaps signal a willingness on Zelensky's part to resume negotiations, or at least to resume negotiations in earnest. Well, I sincerely hope so. I'm not going to get my hopes up. I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think that the outcome of the war will still be decided militarily. I think the Russians are now profoundly cynical and exasperated with the Ukrainians, and I don't personally think that anything can happen that's going to save that Ukrainian army in Donbass. But we will see what takes place over the next few days and whether reality will finally break through in Kiev. Well, that's all I wanted to say today about the military situation. If there's any more developments, both in Donbass and in this rather strange battle that's taking place, or may be taking place, or may still be taking place around Snake Island, then I will let you all know. And thank you again for joining me today. Remember, you can find us on other platforms, on Rumble and on Locals. And of course, if you're watching this video on Rumble, and indeed if you're watching any Duran or Alexander Mercouris or Alex Christoforou videos on Rumble, then if you go to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that button, that will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can decide to join our community, our Locals community, become an active member, participate in my Wednesday live streams, which take place every Wednesday exclusively on Locals at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And of course, we are also present on other platforms like the new free speech platform SuperU, and also on Odyssey. And of course, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you can also, of course, go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, our amazing and fabulous and brilliant magic mugs. Large assortment of those, by the way, on our shop. And I would quickly add that the feedback we get from people who buy things from our shop is, well, extremely positive. We've always aimed at the Duran to provide quality, and I think you will find that, you know, the items, the merchandise in our shop is of extremely high quality indeed. And last but not least, don't forget to press the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.